Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle into that one spot on the pillow that feels just right, and let the frantic pace of the modern world simply dissolve. We're going to take a very long, very slow, and arguably very rhythmic walk through one of the strangest collective meltdowns in human history. We're talking about a time when a small city in France became the stage for a marathon that nobody wanted to enter. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, a moment when hundreds of people simply lost the ability to stop moving, fueled by stress, superstition, and perhaps a bit of bad rye bread. So get comfortable, adjust your blankets, and let's float back to a sweltering July in Strasbourg, where the streets were filled not with music, but with the terrifying sound of thousands of footsteps that just wouldn't quit. Now, to understand why an entire city decided to dance itself into a state of medical emergency, we have to look at the atmosphere of 1518. Strasbourg, at the time, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and life was, well, it was a bit of a grind. They were coming off a series of bad harvests, the kind where you start looking at your neighbor's cat with a bit too much curiosity. There was famine, there was disease, specifically the English sweat and the French pox, and there was an overwhelming sense that the end of the world was right around the corner. Because in the 16th century, if things went wrong, it wasn't just bad luck. It was usually a sign that a saint was particularly grumpy with you. Enter Frau Trophea. We don't know much about her personal life, but on a random Tuesday in mid-July, she stepped out of her house and into a narrow street and just started to dance. And I don't mean a little joyful jig because she found a spare coin. I mean a frantic, silent, high-intensity solo performance. She didn't have music. She didn't have a partner. She just had an internal rhythm that seemed to be screaming at her to move. Her neighbors watched, probably thinking she'd had a bit too much fermented juice, but the sun went down and she was still going. The sun came up the next morning, and there was Frau Trophea, sweaty, exhausted, and still twitching her way through the cobblestones. She kept this up for 6 days, 6 days of nonstop movement. Her feet were likely bleeding, her face a mask of exhaustion, but she couldn't or wouldn't stop. By the end of the week, 34 other people had joined her. Not because it looked like fun, mind you. They didn't look happy. They looked terrified. They looked like people who were being moved by invisible strings, their limbs flailing in a mockery of a celebration. By the end of the month, the dance floor had expanded to 400 people. The authorities in Strasbourg were, understandably, a bit stumped. They did what any sensible 16th century city council would do. They asked the doctors. Now, modern science might look at this and suggest mass psychogenic illness or perhaps ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and causes hallucinations and spasms. But the doctors of 1518 had a different theory. They decided that the dancers were suffering from hot blood. Their brains were literally overheating, and the body's natural response was to dance the heat away. And here is where the logic takes a very dark, very snarky turn. The council decided that the cure for the dancing was more dancing. They figured if these people just got it all out of their system, they'd eventually stop. So instead of letting them rest or tying them down, the city built a massive wooden stage in the center of the market. They hired professional musicians, fiddlers, and drummers to provide a beat. They even hired strongmen to hold the dancers up when they started to collapse, so they could keep going. Because why try to fix a problem when you can just turn it into a high-budget production? Of course, this backfired spectacularly. Adding music and a stage just made the frenzy more contagious. It was like a 16th century rave, but instead of neon lights and water bottles, there was the smell of death and the sound of cracking joints. People started dying. They were having heart attacks, strokes, or simply collapsing from pure exhaustion. The streets were a mess of flailing limbs and heavy breathing. The city officials, realizing that their dance until you drop plan was literally killing the population, pivoted to the only other logical conclusion. The dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, and there was a popular belief that if you angered him, he would send a plague of dancing upon you. So the council did a complete 180. They banned dancing in the city entirely, they banned music, they even banned idle whistling. They gathered the most afflicted dancers, put them in wagons, and hauled them off to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus in the nearby hills. There, they were given small wooden crosses and red shoes. Yes, red shoes, which is a bit of a creepy detail given the later fairy tales, and told to pray for forgiveness. Slowly, the frenzy began to fade. The dancers' legs finally gave out, the hot blood cooled, and the city of Strasbourg went quiet again. The survivors went back to their hungry, stressful lives, probably never wanting to hear a fiddle again for as long as they lived. It remains one of the most bizarre instances of what happens when the human mind, pushed to the brink by sheer unadulterated misery, decides to just glitch out. As we leave the quiet, exhausted streets of Strasbourg and the echoes of those frantic footsteps, just feel the stillness of the room around you. The dancers have finally sat down. The musicians have packed away their bows. The red shoes are tucked under a bed, silent and still. So, the dancers of Strasbourg have finally found their rest. Their red shoes gathering dust in the corners of dark rooms, the frantic rhythm of the plague replaced by the heavy silence of a city trying to forget it ever lost its mind. But as we float away from the Rhine, we're heading west, deeper into France, and further back in time to the late 14th century. We're going to the court of King Charles VI, a man who began his reign as the Beloved and ended it as the Mad. If the people of Strasbourg suffered from a glitch of the body, Charles suffered from a total shattering of the self. To understand Charles, you have to imagine a young man who was, by all accounts, the perfect 14th century prince. He was athletic, he was handsome, and he was popular. But the crown of France was a heavy thing, especially with the 100 Years' War looming and his uncles constantly bickering over his inheritance like vultures over a fresh kill. The pressure was building, a silent steam engine inside his skull, until it finally exploded on a hot August day in 1392. Charles was riding with his army through a forest near Le Mans, heading off to settle a score with a rebellious noble. It was a stiflingly hot day. Suddenly, a ragged, barefoot man, likely a local beggar or a visionary, leaped out from behind a tree and grabbed the king's bridle. He screamed, "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" The guards chased the man away, but the damage was done. The seed of paranoia had been planted in the hot, damp soil of the king's mind. A few minutes later, a page dropped his lance, and the clatter of metal against a shield rang through the forest like a gunshot. Charles snapped. He drew his sword, screamed that he was surrounded by traitors, and began to charge his own men. He killed several of his own knights before he was finally wrestled from his horse. When he woke up, the beloved king was gone. In his place was a man who didn't recognize his wife and who believed his name was George. Because why be a king when you can be a George? This was just the beginning of a 30-year descent into one of the most famous cases of royal instability. Charles would have lucid intervals where he was perfectly normal, followed by months of terrifying delusions. His most famous quirk, the one that really makes you want to snuggle deeper into your blankets, was the glass delusion. For long periods, Charles became convinced that he was made of glass. He was terrified that if anyone touched him or if he sat down too quickly, he would shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. To prevent his own destruction, he had special clothes made. He wore heavy, padded robes reinforced with iron ribs, creating a sort of wearable birdcage to keep his fragile glass body from cracking. He refused to let anyone come within 3 feet of him. If you were a servant in the French court, your job wasn't just to bring the king wine, it was to ensure that the monarch didn't accidentally turn into a pile of shards on the rug. During his worst episodes, he would run through the halls of the palace until he collapsed, howling like a wolf. He refused to bathe or change his clothes for months at a time, convinced that the water would destroy him. He became so covered in filth and sores that his physicians eventually had to hire 10 men to disguise themselves in black masks, burst into his room, and forcibly wash him. It was less of a royal spa day and more of a medieval SWAT team operation. While the king was busy being fragile, his court was falling apart. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, was doing her best to run a country that was being torn apart by civil war in the invading English, led by Henry V. The tragedy of Charles was that he was a man who loved his country, but literally couldn't hold himself together long enough to save it. He spent his final years as a ghost in his own palace, a glass king, watching his kingdom break apart as easily as he feared he would. When Charles finally died in 1422, he left behind a France that was almost entirely occupied by the English. But he also left behind a legacy of the bizarre ways the human mind tries to protect itself from a reality that is simply too heavy to bear. He wasn't just a king who lost his mind, he was a man who tried to turn himself into something beautiful and breakable to avoid the messiness of being human. As we leave the quiet, padded rooms of the Louvre and the shivering king in his iron-ribbed robes, just feel the solid weight of the floor beneath you. You are not glass, you are not shattering, the forest is behind us, and the air is still. Part 3. The King Who Was a Museum of Mistakes. So, Charles VI has finally found a world where he doesn't have to worry about shattering, leaving behind a France that was as fractured as his own reflection. But while the Glass King was a tragic glitch in a long line of capable monarchs, we're now floating south, past the Pyrenees, to look at a dynasty that didn't just have a glitch, they had a total system failure. We're going to the 17th century Spanish court to meet Charles II, a man who was less of a king and more of a biological cautionary tale. If Charles VI thought he was made of glass, Charles II of Spain was made of centuries of bad decisions, specifically the decision to keep the family tree looking like a telephone pole. You see, the Spanish Habsburgs were obsessed with purity. They wanted to keep their lands, their titles, and their very specific royal look within the family. So they married cousins to cousins and uncles to nieces over and over again until nature finally threw up its hands and said, "Enough." Charles II was the final result of this genetic closed circuit. To give you an idea of the math, a normal person has 32 unique ancestors in their 5th generation. Charles had 10. He was quite literally more inbred than the offspring of 2 biological siblings. He was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, the court of Madrid knew they were in trouble. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, not because he was particularly magical, but because he looked like he'd been put together by someone who had lost the instruction manual. His most famous feature was the Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a prominent chin, it was a massive, jutting shelf of bone that prevented his teeth from ever meeting. He couldn't chew his food, so he essentially swallowed everything whole like a very regal snake. His tongue was so oversized that he drooled constantly and could barely be understood when he spoke. But the jaw was just the tip of the iceberg. Charles didn't walk until he was 8. He was never educated because the court was simply happy if he survived the afternoon. He was a king, but he had the physical and mental age of a permanent child. He lived in the Escorial, that vast gray granite palace that feels more like a cold cathedral than a home. He spent his days surrounded by priests and exorcists because the Spanish court couldn't accept that their king was the victim of a family tree that was a straight line. They insisted he must be the victim of a curse. Because why blame 100 years of marrying your cousin when you can blame a grumpy sorcerer from the mountains? The treatments Charles endured were enough to make anyone want to hide under their duvet. They brought in the corpses of saints and laid them in bed with him. They fed him potions made of ground-up relics. They even brought in 2 exorcists to interrogate the demons they were sure lived in his stomach. Charles, for his part, was a gentle, sad soul. He was a man who just wanted to play with his dogs and stare at the mountains, but he was trapped in a body that was failing and a role he was never meant to play. The tragedy reached its peak when it came to the succession. Because Charles was the last male Habsburg of the Spanish line, the entire fate of an empire that spanned the globe rested on him producing an heir. He was married twice. His first wife, Marie Louise of France, was reportedly terrified of him, but grew to feel a deep maternal pity for him. When she died, they brought in Maria Anna of Germany, who was far less patient. She spent her days screaming at him and her nights trying to manipulate a man who couldn't even tie his own shoes. The pressure was suffocating. Every time the queen had a stomachache, the bells of Madrid would ring in hope. But Charles was sterile, another gift from his ancestors. He spent his final years watching his ministers and the ambassadors of Europe fight over his kingdom as if he were already dead. He even insisted on seeing the exhumed corpses of his family in the royal crypts, perhaps searching for a sense of belonging in a line of people who had, quite literally, made him who he was. When Charles finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, his autopsy was a document of pure Gothic horror. The doctor famously noted that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his head was full of water, and he had not a single drop of blood. He was a man who had been used up by history before he was even born. As we leave the cold, silent rooms of the Escorial and the heavy, jutting shadows of the Habsburgs, just feel the weight of that dynastic pride. The jaw has finally closed, the line has snapped, the empire is moving into the hands of new men with new faces. So, the Spanish Habsburgs finally flickered out like a candle in a drafty hallway, leaving behind a continent that was about to spend the next 13 years fighting over the scraps of their empire. It's a bit of a grim reminder that you can't outrun your own blood, no matter how much gold you pile on top of it. But as we float away from the granite silence of the Escorial, we're heading east, deep into the heart of a vast, winter-locked empire that was about to find out that its own internal fragility was far more dangerous than any foreign army. We're going to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to meet the Romanovs, specifically the 4 sisters and the 1 boy who lived in a world of velvet, snow, and a secret that would eventually bring a 300-year-old dynasty to its knees. To understand the Romanov children, you have to understand the atmosphere they were born into. It was a world of absolute, suffocating luxury, but it was a luxury wrapped in a thick, heavy layer of anxiety. Their father, Tsar Nicholas II, was a man who much preferred a quiet family dinner to the business of ruling an empire of 150 million people. He was gentle, he was soft-spoken, and he was arguably the last person you'd want in charge during a revolution. Their mother, Alexandra, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she brought with her a deep, mystical piety and a very specific genetic ticking time bomb. They had 4 daughters first, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. They were known collectively as OTMA, a name they formed from their initials. They were beautiful, they were spirited, and they were, by the standards of the day, incredibly isolated. They lived in a sort of gilded bubble at the Alexander Palace, far away from the simmering resentment and the smog of the industrializing cities. They slept on hard camp beds, took cold baths, and spent their days studying, knitting, and playing in the snow, all while being guarded by soldiers who were increasingly wondering why they were protecting people who lived in a fairy tale while the rest of the country was starving. But the real drama of the Romanov nursery revolved around the youngest, the long-awaited son and heir, Alexei. Born in 1904, Alexei was the sunbeam of the family. He was a bright, handsome boy, but he carried a secret that was kept from the world with the intensity of a military defense plan. He had hemophilia, the royal disease passed down through the female line of Victoria's descendants. For Alexei, a simple stumble on the palace floor wasn't just a bump, it was a potential death sentence. An internal bleed could keep him in agony for weeks, his joints swelling until he couldn't move, his face turning as pale as the Russian snow. The Tsar and Serena were desperate. They kept his illness a state secret, which meant they couldn't explain to the public why the heir to the throne was suddenly disappearing for months or being carried everywhere by a giant sailor named Dedivenko. Because why just have a normal childhood when you can have one where a sneeze might cause a national crisis? This desperation led the Serena directly into the arms of Grigory Rasputin. Now, history has painted Rasputin as a sort of hyper-powered wizard monk with magical eyes, but to the Romanovs, he was simply the friend. He was a Siberian peasant with unwashed hair and a reputation for being, well, let's just say excessive in his personal life. But he had a knack for calming Alexei, whether it was through hypnosis, prayer, or simply telling the boy to stop taking the aspirin the doctors gave him, which, in a cruel twist of history, actually makes bleeding worse. He seemed to be the only one who could stop the pain. The presence of this holy man in the palace was the ultimate PR disaster. Rumors swirled through the cafes of St. Petersburg that Rasputin was running the government, that he was the Serena's lover, that he was a dark sorcerer controlling the Tsar. The more the public hated him, the more the Serena clung to him, convinced that her son's life depended on this one peasant. It was a loop of isolation and paranoia that completely severed the Romanovs from the reality of their country. The children, for their part, adored him. They wrote him sweet, innocent letters, and he told them stories of the Siberian wilderness. They lived in a world of incense, prayers, and velvet, while outside the palace gates, the 20th century was arriving with a loud, violent bang. World War I broke out, and the Romanovs' isolation turned from a quirk into a tragedy. When the Tsar went to the front to lead the troops, he left the Serena, and effectively Rasputin, in charge of the government. It was like leaving a ship in the middle of a hurricane in the hands of someone who only knows how to navigate by looking at the stars. When the revolution finally came in 1917, the children were almost confused. They had been kept so sheltered that they didn't understand why the soldiers who used to salute them were now spitting on their shadows. They were moved from palace to palace, their world shrinking until it was just a few rooms in a house in Yekaterinburg, the house of special purpose. Even in captivity, they tried to maintain their little world. They put on plays, they studied their French, and they tended to their sick brother. They were teenagers who had been taught they were semi-divine, now washing their own clothes in a bucket and being taunted by their guards. There is a profound, quiet sadness in those final photos of the Romanov children, shaven heads because of measles, thin faces, but still possessing that strange, distant royal calm. As we leave the cold, quiet cellar of the Ipratiev house and the echoes of a lost empire, just feel the stillness of the Russian night. The velvet is gone. The sunbeam has faded. The prayers of the friend could not save the throne. Part 5. The Winter Queen, a throne of snow and glass. So, we've watched the Romanov children drift from the gilded warmth of the Alexander Palace into the cold, permanent silence of the Russian forest, a family undone by a secret in the blood, and a world that simply stopped believing in fairy tales. It's a heavy thought, isn't it? The way a crown can become a weight that sinks the person wearing it. But as we float away from the icy Neva, we're heading west again, back toward the Rhine, to meet a woman who was born into the highest of Stuart hopes, only to become history's most elegant refugee. This is the story of Elizabeth Stuart, the Winter Queen. Elizabeth was the daughter of King James I of England and the sister of the ill-fated Charles I. She was witty, she was beautiful, and she was, by all accounts, the it girl of the early 17th century. In 1613, she married Frederick V, the Elector Palatine. It was a grand, glittering match. They were young, they were in love, and they were the power couple of the Protestant world. For a while, they lived in Heidelberg Castle, where Frederick built her the Hortus Palatinus, a garden so magnificent it was called the eighth wonder of the world. Because when you're a royal in love, a simple bouquet of roses just doesn't quite cut it. You need an entire mountain transformed into a botanical paradise. But then, in 1619, the people of Bohemia decided they'd had enough of their Catholic Habsburg rulers, those same jaw-heavy cousins we met earlier. They offered the throne to Frederick. Elizabeth, perhaps dreaming of a grander title, or perhaps just possessed by that relentless Stuart optimism, encouraged him to take it. "I would rather eat dry bread at a king's table than feast at an elector's," she reportedly said. It's one of those quotes that sounds great in a screenplay, but looks a bit awkward when the bread actually starts getting dry and the soldiers start knocking on the door. They moved to Prague and were crowned. Elizabeth was a queen at last. But the Habsburgs weren't exactly the type of people to let a kingdom go just because someone else sat in the chair. Within a year, the imperial armies arrived. At the Battle of White Mountain, Frederick's forces were crushed. The Winter King and his queen were forced to flee Prague in such a hurry that they reportedly left behind jewels, clothes, and even their youngest son's favorite toys. They had ruled for just one winter. From that point on, Elizabeth became the Winter Queen, a title that sounds poetic and crystalline, but actually just meant she was a monarch without a country. For the next 40 years, she lived in exile in The Hague. She went from the eighth wonder of the world to living on the charity of her Dutch relatives and whatever funds she could beg from her brother in England. Elizabeth's life in exile was a long, slow exercise in maintaining dignity while everything else fell apart. She had 13 children, many of whom she barely saw as they were sent off to various courts or wars. She watched from afar as her brother, King Charles I, lost his head on a scaffold in London. She saw her husband die of a fever, leaving her a widow in a foreign land with a mountain of debts that would have made a Mississippi scheme investor blush. Yet, she never stopped acting like a queen. She kept a small, ragged court. She surrounded herself with her beloved hunting dogs and her books. She was a prolific letter writer, sharp-tongued and observant, watching the 30 Years' War tear Europe apart from the sidelines. She was a woman who had lost her throne, her husband, and her home, but she refused to lose her style. She was the grandmother of the Enlightenment, a woman who proved that you can be a queen even if your only territory is the room you're standing in. The irony, the sleepless historian irony that keeps us up at night, is that while Elizabeth never sat on her throne again, her bloodline won the long game. When the Stuart line in England finally ran out of heirs, it was Elizabeth's grandson who was invited to take the throne as George I. Every British monarch since, including the present ones, is a direct descendant of the Winter Queen. She didn't keep her kingdom, but she provided the DNA for the next 3 centuries of British history. She finally returned to England in 1661, an old woman coming home to a country she hadn't seen in nearly 50 years. She died shortly after, finally finding a permanent home in Westminster Abbey, resting just a few feet away from the kings and queens who had once looked down on the refugee from the Rhine. As we leave the misty canals of The Hague and the quiet corner of the Abbey, just feel the cool air of a Bohemian winter. The gardens of Heidelberg are in ruins. The dry bread has been eaten. The queen is finally warm. The night is still. The snow has stopped falling. Everything is quiet. Subscribe if you love this kind of immersive historical storytelling. It's not just facts, it's feelings. Drop your current city and time in the comments. I love knowing who's sailing the night seas with me.